All right, we'll get started. Can I just get a thumbs up or something from any of the WSP team just to confirm everybody can hear us? We're just excellent. Thank you. All right. Welcome today to our webinar session on climate-related disclosures in Australia. We'll talk a little bit about the reasons for this session, but I might just, if I can, start immediately with acknowledging country. So at WSP, we acknowledge that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people are really connected to the projects and the work that we're doing, and we do acknowledge their ongoing connections to the land, sea, sky, and pay our respects to their elders past and present. All our projects are built on a place that has First Peoples history, story, unique design, and language. And specifically as an engineering and consulting firm, we acknowledge that we have influence over the built environment, and we do recognise our responsibility to ensuring that First Peoples culture and connections to country are strong and continued into the future. And again, at WSP, we do also try and interpret that where we can. What you're seeing on screen is a piece of graphic design that's been developed for WSP that does reflect on that theme of First Nations connection to country. Just to briefly then introduce you to who is here today. So for those I don't know, my name's Bernadette Fitzgerald. I am the Director of Sustainability and Climate Change at WSP in Australia. And I'm joined by a number of people here today from our region and sort of globally as well, to talk a little bit about our experiences of working on climate change mandatory disclosure reporting. I'll let everybody introduce themselves specifically, but just suffice to say the team here has actually been delivering these for clients. We've also had our own experience this year of doing our first mandatory disclosure report for WSP Australia, and that has been a process as well, and quite an interesting reflection on how that works on the client side as well. Our team does include a mixture of people with different skills, people like Matt, who has sort of a practice lead lens for the broader WSP team. David, who's joined us, he's currently in Australia, but he is our global sustainability, climate change and future ready lead, who can talk a little bit about what's going on globally. And Azura and Katlin, who are actually delivering these things for our clients and also for WSP in Australia as well. So they'll have some reflections on how that all works. This is a webinar, but it is a Q&A type webinar, so please do feel free to start putting in your Q&A questions into the Q&A function or in the chat, depending on how your screen's coming up. And probably just also maybe just to get things going, ask you all to just reflect on what you are finding for yourselves in your experience with mandatory disclosure, or even thinking about what that might mean for your organisation. What are you feeling are the biggest risks or the biggest areas that you're sort of concerned about or trying to work through? And we'll try and get back to those at the end of the session. It'd also be really interesting to see if there are some similar themes about what people are experiencing in that space as well, and maybe also our own reflections on how that's worked for us as a business. So today we will briefly go over the context of climate. Oh, and the other thing I had to do as well is just to confirm, we are recording this session, and that's for our internal monitoring purposes and QA purposes. If you do have any issues with that, please message and we'll understand that situation. This group of people invited is a sort of a view of our particularly special clients within WSP in Australia. It is a safe space. We do acknowledge that this is a confidential space as well. If there are questions that people want to talk about, please sort of keep that in mind as well. So again, I'll talk a little bit about the disclosure space. I'll give you some context, probably stuff you already know. And then we'll talk a little bit about what we've been doing. So Matt will talk a little bit about the disclosure material space. We'll talk about some transition planning that we've been involved in and some examples, and then David will sort of conclude with some of his thoughts on what he's seeing broadly and globally, and really sort of coming to a practical view of how mandatory disclosure can actually provide a implementable, practical, helpful set of things for an organisation to work through and adopt. And this slide here is just sort of reconfirming WSP in Australia is we do go the whole way around the country. We've got a recent new office in Townsville as well, nothing in Tasmania yet. And so we're working with a range of clients with lots of different assets, lots of different climate risks as well as part of that. So I think we'll then start just getting into the climate disclosure context setting. So if we want to just reflect on what the disclosure is, it's sort of a multi-part process. It is governed by the AASB standards that have been released, and that includes both standards and guidance. That is a governance process around how that works. So that's all generally been released. And we've been working through that as part of our first mandatory disclosure processes this year in Australia. Moving on to, again, what you probably already know is who is impacted. So a lot of our organisations probably fall into Group 1. And these are associated with the amount of revenue or a number of employees or the NG's emissions boundaries that you might already be reporting under. So same if you're doing NG's, but with that climate view and that transition view that hasn't been part of that process to date. And then moving through over the next couple of years, the intent is that will start to broaden out until it will pick up sort of most larger organisations who are operating or have subsidiary operations in Australia. Moving on to, again, what the assurance scope looks like. So again, there is assurance processes associated with this year's reporting, and there is a limited assurance over the scope 1 and 2 emissions and gas reporting that's already existed, but then moving through to bring that in more broadly as the maturity and the capacity of the industry for assurance in this space does increase over the next couple of years as well. And the Scope 3 emissions boundary is something that we're not necessarily disclosing this year, but we are certainly beginning to investigate and understand what that looks like for our organisations. So, Matt, I'll hand over to you. Please correct me on all the things I've probably not gotten right, and I'll leave it there and I'll come back at the end for Q&A. Thank you.
Flawless, Bernadette. Thank you.
Oh, Matt, I think you've lost your sound.
Yeah, I wasn't sure if it was my Teams or if it was Matt. We're having a day of it. I already had to restart my computer.
Give me 1 moment. Did that do anything for me?
Yeah, it's a little jumpy, but give it a go.
Any luck? No?
Better. Go.
How about now? You can hear me? Great.
Yes.
Fantastic.
Matt. I thought you completely dropped out for a second.
Better late than never.
Okay.
Yeah. All right. Well, as I was saying, I lead with some challenges WSP's climate disclosure support services in this part of the world where I've lived and worked for almost a decade, having left the US in my career there as an environmental corporate lawyer. Australia's climate disclosure standard requires disclosure of all material information relevant to every area of disclosure. And the challenge for all of us is what constitutes material information. But that's a decision that's actually specific to each reporting entity. And as a reporting entity, you're being tasked with that duty, but you're also being allowed the flexibility to decide your criteria and thresholds for materiality, provided you can explain your decision-making process and the assumptions underlying that process. And that also means that materiality will not be an apples to apples comparison from one company's climate disclosure to another's, For your auditors and your investors, your creditors, your insurers, your decision-making about material information may be as important or more important than the material information that you disclose itself. Let's talk about what we can glean from the legal definition of material information. So the definition is information is material if omitting, misstating, or obscuring that information could reasonably be expected to influence decisions that primary users of general purpose financial reports make on their basis. And I'd like to cover each of these part by part. Information is material if omitting, misstating, or obscuring that information. That means that you should err on the side of disclosure, but a contextualized disclosure of that information. And I'll talk about an illustrative example in a minute. Could reasonably be expected to influence decisions. This means that we're not just disclosing the effects of climate change on your organization, but how your organization contributes to the effects of climate change, primarily through your greenhouse gas emissions. That primary users of general purpose financial reports make on their basis. This means that disclosures are about informing investors based in part on what they're expecting to see disclosed. So as an example, WSP worked with a coastal airport that decided to disclose two lists of risks and opportunities. There was a list of material, climate-related risks and opportunities identified through the airport's climate scenario analysis. They also disclosed a separate list of further risks that investors may consider to be material information. So in that particular context, one of the material risks for this coastal airport was the risk of inundation of access roads to the airport because of a storm surge, which could prevent that passenger influx and outflow to the airport for some period. And that was assessed as a risk that would be likely from 2040 on under one of the higher warming sets of climate change data projections. Now, in contrast, a risk that the airport disclosed but hadn't deemed material is the risk that chronic sea level rise inundates the airport's assets, including the terminal and the runways, which are protected by seawalls, and the airport itself, the runway is actually rather high up. But at worst, that's a long-term risk to the airport. The airport's priority is to address the material risk to storm surges blocking access roads for travelers. And the risk to the airport's assets is something investors would notice if it were missing, but it's not the priority or level of materiality as that risk to that ground transport infrastructure. So it helps to be in the same mindset as your investors. Disclosing greenhouse gas emissions is required in part because any disclosure of greenhouse gas emissions is considered de facto material. Greenhouse gas emissions contribute to climate change. They have a cost. At the moment, carbon costs are largely externalized, but the cost of carbon will increasingly be internalized. Material information includes impacts to your business model across your value chain. For example, a mining company should be considering impacts to ports of loading in Australia and to the ports of discharge in China. And the operators of those ports should be considering sector-wide risks to the mining operations that they rely on as part of their business model. And ultimately, material information includes financially material effects on your business, such as through stranded or impaired assets, changes to the fair valuation of assets, increased costs or reduced demand for products and services, including fossil fuels, insurance premiums, provision for contingent liabilities. And my colleague Azura Patterson-Ng will talk about this more in a few minutes. A few final thoughts on material information. First off, disclose all material indirect impacts, cascading impacts, cumulative impacts on your business. Your material risks may be beyond the borders of your assets or your direct relationships within your value chain. Remember that storm surge risk to that coastal airport's access roads. The airport doesn't own or control those access roads, and that's irrelevant because preventing access to the airport is a material impact on them. Second, your criteria or threshold for materiality is contextual. I would caution you about presuming that materiality and determining a threshold is about using some financial model to output a defined threshold represented by a number or a numerical range. That may work for you, but you also want to remember that a lot of this is a bit of a, especially early in maturity, more of a qualitative judgment. And what's material information over your short, medium, and long-term time horizons depends on how many and which climate scenarios you've used. Your investors might not all have the same time horizon, so it's not going to be a simple matter of finding a number or a threshold or a range to across the board say this is what is material. And lastly, the Australian Securities and Investments Commission is the regulator, but I'd suggest that compliance, which ASIC will require while allowing for some interpretation early in the implementation of this new form of reporting, that may actually be less of a concern for a lot of reporting entities than greenwashing, both as a legal risk and a reputational risk of even the perception of greenwashing. So that's something to really keep in mind as you're doing this. It's not just a compliance exercise. And on that note, I'll hand the baton to my colleague, Katlin Donelley, to speak about transition planning.
Great, thanks, Matt. So yeah, I'm Katlin Donelley. I'm a climate disclosure specialist working in the team with my colleagues on the call today, and I'll be covering off an introduction to climate transition planning and focusing on preparing for transition planning, touching on some key preparation steps to help set up an implementable plan, and also relate this back to a case study to help illustrate that disclosure is more about the progress made towards transitioning your business model and strategy rather than providing a fully fledged plan on paper. So I just wanted to speak to something that highlights some of the evidence of the effects from climate change and how it's increasing the urgency for companies to prepare to respond to their climate-related risks and opportunities. So in September, I'm sure everyone on the call is aware that the Australian government published its first National Climate Risk Assessment, and it showed cascading and compounding climate hazards across all regions of Australia. And some of the key findings included significant asset and economic exposure and projected property losses of $600+ billion by 2050. So the importance of this work for Australia does highlight that early planning and preparation now for change in things like asset values, insurance, and stakeholder expectations are all drivers for assessing how you may respond across your strategy and decision making. So what actually is transition planning? The AASB defines it as an aspect of an entity's overall strategy, and it lays out the entity's targets, actions, or resources for a transition to a lower carbon economy. To achieve this, though, it's all about bringing areas of your business together that are already managing your climate-related risks and opportunities. So that could be things like your emissions reduction planning or adaptation planning. It also considers your value chain, so that's within the scope of transition planning, and you'll want to look at risks and opportunities across your value chain and apply what those in your value chain are doing to transition, as disclosing transition planning aspects of your strategy does include what other companies are doing. So it's really a tool that is used to embed processes and plans for responding to climate risks across your business strategy and for enabling long-term strategic direction. It's about identifying tangible actions across your business and establishing how these will be implemented, resourced, and monitored over time, and emphasises that transition planning is not intended to be a static plan. Rather, it's an iterative and dynamic process built on year. So I'm going to move through some of these points on screen relatively quickly, but it provides a bit of an overview and some key steps to help you in preparing how you're going to respond to the lessons learned from things like your climate scenario analysis or the assessment of effects from your climate-related risks and opportunities. So you may start with reassessing your foundational assumptions of your business model and strategy and considering how these might be vulnerable to disruption under different climate scenarios, and using your climate scenarios to assess what successes or challenges may be presented and identify your strategic intent and direction of your transition plan. Once you have a clearer understanding of your founding assumptions and your strategic intent, you can assess your long-term value proposition and identify strategic choices that would better position yourself and your entity, and what shifts you would need to make to achieve some of these. Across your strategic options, you'll also begin to see some existing and potential tangible actions that can be used to manage or address your risks and opportunities, and things to monitor in the form of signals and triggers, which will support your transition planning pathways and direction. And resourcing actions is a critical step for ensuring success of your transition plan. So this includes assigning roles and ownerships, as well as capital deployment for your actions. And the ongoing year-on-year implementation of your plan will involve what we call push functions, like having workstream owners delivering on actions, as well as pull functions like monitoring signals in the market or other trends to inform your transition planning pathways. So I'm going to use a case study from a company across the aged care sector that has a large focus on transition planning for more climate resilience. So in order for them to identify tangible and implementable actions, they looked at some early assessments like their physical climate risk assessments of their assets and reviewed some of the effects from past extreme weather events on their operations and business continuity. And during this process, they realized how dependent their operations are on the resilience of their value chain and the value chain's capacity to respond. For example, the capacity of civil and emergency defence to respond during disasters. They also use climate scenario analysis to realise that there is flexibility within their business model to respond across climate scenarios and what changing demand for care in the future could mean for them. And so to illustrate how this could be monitored using a bit of a metro map inspired diagram. So this shows an example of two sub work streams. So asset strategy being one and resilient supply chains is another. And each of these would be comprised of various do now and do later actions. And using signals as your early warning signs for monitoring the pathways of these work streams. So for example, monitoring insurance costs for rising flood exposure, or monitoring the frequency of climate events that cuts off climate critical supply routes. And then applying triggers to identify where decision points are across time and under your climate scenarios. So for example, insurance premiums exceeding an identified threshold or coverage being withdrawn could be a decision point that would trigger a do later action, for example, relocating or divesting from certain locations. So this metro map sort of provides a proactive approach to monitoring and definitely highlights how dynamic transition planning should be. But yeah, that brings me to the end of an overview of climate transition planning, and hopefully what you've taken away is that although it's a core piece of climate disclosures, it's really a valuable strategic business exercise, and while challenging, it's all about preparation and iterative progress. I'll hand over to Azura Patterson-Ng, who's going to give an intro and overview of anticipated financial effects with a more practical approach.
Thanks so much, Katlin. Azura Patterson-Ng. I'm a senior advisor in specialising in climate disclosures and particularly in financial effects for climate disclosures. So, as Katlin said, today I'm going to cover off an introduction to financial effects. This is really one of the key quantitative components of the strategy portion of your disclosure reporting. So what actually are financial effects? So in terms of what the Australian standard is asking for, there's really two main components. So the first of these is your current financial effects, and these are where risks and opportunities have already had an effect in the current reporting year. So in theory, these should be relatively straightforward to identify because you can pinpoint specific events or trends that have happened within the reporting year. Now, anticipated financial effects are typically a little bit more challenging because this is about understanding effects that may happen in the future under different climate scenarios and time horizons, and also taking into account the actions from your transition planning, which Katlin has just covered. For both current and anticipated financial effects, we're talking about the effects on your financial statement. So that is financial position, financial performance, and cash flows. Now, because anticipated financial effects are a little bit more complex, I'm going to briefly explore a little bit more about what's required and how to approach these. So let's just say that you're an airport, and one of the material climate risks that you might have identified is the risk of flooding. The photo on the left there is actually from the 2023 flooding events, and that's Cairns Airport. Let's just say that's one of your material risks. Now, there's a few things you're going to want to understand in order to get to your anticipated financial effects. So the first one is actually having a really good understanding, first of all, of what your transition plan is and what actions are in there that are going to help you to address this risk. The second thing is going to be having some kind of understanding of the baseline risk. And what I mean by that is, what is the risk before you take any action to reduce it? And that could be done, for example, using climate data or projections to understand future trends. The third thing you're then going to want to understand is, how effective are the actions in your transition plan actually going to be at reducing that baseline risk? And within that transition plan, you might actually have multiple options with varying levels of effectiveness, but also varying levels of cost-benefit ratio. And then lastly, all of that information is going to come together to help you understand what is the residual risk of the flooding, taking into account all of the actions in your transition plan. And you then need to understand what are the associated financial effects across your financial statement. Now, a key thing here is also to remember that it's about the whole of your financial statement. So it's not just the really obvious things like, what would the cleanup costs be, for example. You also need to think about things like, what impact is this going to have on revenue or on asset valuation, for example. Quantifying financial effects can be a bit daunting, and it really is about bringing together climate information and financial accounting principles together. For anticipated financial effects in particular, there's always going to be an inherent amount of uncertainty because we're talking about future timeframes and future climate scenarios. But the essence of what the standard is really asking for is to provide an indication of what's potentially at stake, rather than asking you to achieve kind of perfect accuracy. At WSP, we've developed a systematic capability building framework to help organizations quantify their financial effects. And we really think the benefit of this approach is that all the calculations or assumptions are very transparent and are based on your expert understanding of your own organization. To conclude, I'm just going to leave you with a couple of key considerations for financial effects that will be useful in getting you started. So the first one is that you can disclose financial effects as ranges, which can be really helpful as a way of communicating that uncertainty. Secondly, the same definition for materiality applies for financial effects as it does for the rest of the disclosure, and that's the materiality definition that Matt was speaking about earlier. So what this really means in practice is that certain figures that may not otherwise be material in other financial frameworks or contexts could potentially still be material in a climate disclosure context. So that's just a really important thing to keep in mind. And lastly, ASSB has put out some guidance on proportionality mechanisms. And what this means is really just that what you disclose should be proportional to the skills and abilities and resources that you have available to your entity without any undue cost or effort. And the final thing I want to say about financial effects is that kind of outside of disclosures, really understanding your financial effects can be incredibly helpful for your internal decision making and strategy. It can help you understand costs and benefits of different transition planning options, for example, or it could even provide you with a really useful basis for understanding how spending money to do something now could end up saving you money in the long term. So thank you, and I will pass over now to David Symons, who's going to talk to us a little bit about Future Ready and some global examples around using climate disclosures. Thanks, David.
Thank you, and hello, everybody. So yes, I'm David Symons. I'm London-based, but I have the privilege of having a global role within WSP, and I've got the privilege of working this week and next in Australia and New Zealand with our clients. And I suppose that the overarching message that I'd like to share with you and bring to life is that while this webinar is talking about climate disclosures, the most important thing to anticipate is that disclosure is just a means to an end. The most important thing is to really focus, if you're understanding what your climate risks are, if you're putting the governance in place to manage them, yes, by all means, make sure that we are communicating that to investors and to shareholders and potential shareholders. But the most important thing is to understand those climate risks, what they really mean to your business, and then to have an effective process for taking action. And that's not necessarily just writing some really great forms of words. It's about really understanding them and taking action within your business. And if I just bring that to life from an international perspective, so in London, we have the FTSE 350. We have seen companies citing extreme or unusual weather events as a reason for faltering or unexpected sales. That is getting higher and higher each year. And if I just give you 3 examples that I've come across in just recently, and this is right across the sector. So let me take you to bakeries. We have a company. Please keep on the previous slide. We have a company called Greggs. They're a bakery. Their sausage rolls, their vegan sausage rolls, are famous in the UK, and they've been quite a darling of the stock exchange. They warned that the heat wave in June boosted demand for cold drinks, but reduced overall shopper numbers because people simply weren't coming out to the high street. I could take you to the same with Currys. They're an electrical retailer. They identified and reported to investors that, again, very, very hot summer that we've had in the UK, increasing footfall from customers seeking air conditioning units in some regions. But also they saw that in a heat wave that was pushing customers to be shopping more online than in stores. And Currys particularly, his focus is come to the store rather than shopping online and actually feel the kit before you buy. So that was impacting them from extreme weather. And then if you come closer to home, Rio Tinto, I think that there's a number from the mining sector who are on. They disclosed that extreme weather in April had impacted operations in Pilbara at the iron ore mine there, since recovered. But this is the reality of how climate change is impacting. And Royal Bank of Canada earlier this year also noted that was why it was beginning to take a renewed focus on robustness of adapting to climate change and impacts, rather than just a previous focus on mitigation. So if I bring that across to infrastructure, this slide that you've been looking at, here's a very practical example of some climate risk work that we've done with the UK Strategic Roads Agency called National Highways. And here systematically we've been working with National Highways actually for several years to understand climate risk. And again, yes, we've done the disclosure. National Highways is one of the first national infrastructure organisations, I think, worldwide to disclose to TCFD requirements. But fundamentally, we've started here with a really, really practical understanding of what does extreme weather mean for a roads agency. And without going through all of these, the key things that really this draws out is extreme rainfall. That leads to pooling of water on road networks. That leads to delays, leads to increased fatalities, and also that leads to things like scouring of bridges and the like. So this is very, very practical engineering impact as a result of that. And that's where, again, in WSP, that this is our uniqueness, that we're really being able to take the science and apply that in an engineering context to practically understand those risks and deal with them, allying that to management consultancy. And this is the relevant piece, really, that this is not just a management consultancy thing. To really understand climate risk, it's science, engineering, management consultancy, to really knit all of those together. The same principle as well. The other key risk with national highways is that in very, very hot weather, in Brisbane at the moment, my goodness, was that hot yesterday. This leads to changes in road surfaces. It leads to trucks puckering road surfaces. And that leads to increased maintenance costs as well, directly impacting the operation of assets for these roads agencies. So that, I suppose, takes me to three key lessons over and above the focus on really keeping it real and taking practical action. So I would suggest that there's three areas that I would really encourage all firms to take note of over and above, as part of really understanding climate risk and over and above effective disclosure. Is first of all, what we've generally found when we've looked at organisations is very often organisations look at individual risks on their own, and actually some of the most important climate impacts happen at some of the interconnecting risk world. We've heard a couple. Matt mentioned the airport and the access roads have an impact. I'll give you another example. We were doing some work for the Stockholm Emergency Institute. They asked us to look at what was the impact of rising lake levels around Lake Malaran due to more rapid snow melt. And their initial anticipation that was just going to lead to some localized road flooding in the roads near to the lake. Actually, what our risk analysis showed that there was an electricity substation that would be knocked out by those higher lake levels. That of itself was manageable. The key concern was that was the only intake, the only electricity supply for the city's drinking water pumps. Now, I'm pleased to say that Stockholm's water supply is now much more resilient. That was a surprise for everybody. But it's those interconnecting risks that are often understood, undermanaged. And I would say probably also the same with tipping points as well. Typically, most organizations' climate risk reports focus on incremental changes. If it's a little bit hotter, I think what we're beginning to really understand also is that there is a significant risk of tipping points caused by ocean current changes, Antarctic sea ice melt, and the like, that lead to some very, very rapid changes. Now, they're hard to understand and hard to deal with, but that shouldn't mean that organizations shouldn't consider the likelihood of that in risk assessments as well. Point two, embed climate risks in corporate plans and strategies. Look, I think the important thing here is to really understand that this isn't just something that sits sort of out on the edge as a scientific report or as a disclosure piece. It's really important to keep this practically embedded in strategies and delivery programs. And if I just give you another example, I have the privilege of doing quite a lot of work in the whiskey sector. So who wouldn't love to be doing this work? Now, I've had one of my clients this year. They're based on Speyside. That's the main whiskey producing area. It's been a very dry summer in the UK. They haven't been able to operate their distillery for the last 3 months because water levels in the River Spey have been too low due to the lack of rainfall in Scotland. Who would know Scotland would struggle on rainfall? This is the reality of climate change. And so right now we are working with them, thinking about closed loop cooling systems, thinking about how to manage and address that in practice, because this is the reality of climate change. In a very traditional industry, they have been unable to operate their distillery for a quarter of the year, which would be a tragedy if that would limit Scotch whisky supplies around the world to us all. And then my third area is just to conclude that if I think about the net zero programs that we're delivering with many of our clients, we have very, very good programmatic ways of delivering this. We know what the targets are for delivering net zero. If you've got science-based targets, we're aiming to halve carbon across 3 scopes by 2030. We know what we're aiming for. We know the elements that we need to deliver to get there. We know who's in charge of each area. We've got delivery plans. We've got programs for those areas. We've got those funded. Generally, our experience with climate risk is that there isn't that level of rigor and resilience to address that yet. We are putting that in place with a number of our clients now, but I would say that that's probably the most important thing is when we talk about climate risk, let's understand clearly what we are aiming for, and let's break the actions down into individual work programs with accountability, exactly like we are doing for net zero. And if we combine all of those together as part of disclosure, then that makes both corporates, makes your organizations much more resilient. It gives you the confidence that when we are disclosing those climate risks that these new requirements require, it means that we've got effective programs behind them, and genuinely we can be confident that as climate changes, as we get more weather extremes across Australia, across New Zealand, across the world, that we are less likely to have to be citing extreme weather as a reason for unforeseen and weaker sales or shocks. Because the reality is that climate change is totally foreseeable now and well addressed. It is just another risk that can be well managed. So thank you. I think that concludes our presentations. And Bernadette, back to you for some questions and from the audience. Thank you.
Thanks, David, and thanks everyone for taking us through that. There's actually been a couple of interesting questions come in recently. I've got a number I also wanted to ask, but Matt, I actually think there's 2 that seem quite apt for you to respond to. I don't know if you've looked at those. One is specifically trying to observe what the difference is between the AASB and the XRB in New Zealand, and another also from Jessica asking about the sort of how you work when you have trans-Tasman operations.
Sure, I'll take a stab at that. Hi, Jess. Hope you're well. I mean, there are some kind of legal distinctions between the definitions of materiality in New Zealand and Australia. In practice, though, I'm not really seeing it turn into something different. In both cases, even though there's an argument in New Zealand that you might not need to actually really focus quite as much on your impact on climate change as you would your impact or climate change's impact on you. I think that companies that have to do these disclosures everywhere understand that investors are expecting them to talk about the impact that they are contributing to climate change. So, I guess the short, somewhat evasive answer is it doesn't really matter that there's a slightly different definition, because in practice, the disclosures that we've seen so far, this may change as we go through into years 2 and 3 of the Australian regime. You might see some separation, but yeah, they're in practice they're being interpreted pretty similarly. And in terms of the differences in transition planning requirements and resilience for the New Zealand and Australian requirements, I mean, there's a bit of a backtracking going on right now, or some proposed legislation in New Zealand to shrink the number of organizations that actually have to do this disclosure, and that's causing a lot more of a shift towards alignment with Australia, especially for those organizations that have an Australian parent. Katlin, though, I might ask you to weigh on this too, having done transition planning work for clients on both sides of the Tasman. What's your view?
Yeah, I think to Jess's point, the differences between transition planning requirements and then the climate resilience requirements, and on the Australian standards, you don't prescriptively see the climate resilience requirements in the New Zealand XRB standards, but I think that climate resilience component is building on more of the scenario analysis work done through climate disclosures, and then the transition planning that's within that strategy and decision making. So the actual mitigation and adaptation efforts sort of nestled within those requirements of the Australian standards.
All right. Thanks, Katlin. There's a question from Tim. It was actually probably one I was going to get to as well, which I think is around what is the responsibilities in terms of Australian corporations reporting, both in terms of when they are sort of Australian organisations with international operations or non-Australian organisations who have operations in Australia. So how does that work? And I'm just sort of reflecting on what Tim has noted in his question.
I mean, this is definitely a legal question, and we are not going to. The main answer is talk to your legal counsel. But in our experience, if you have an Australian entity that fits the criteria that Bernadette went through before, you're covered. So. I mean, we've been helping WSP Australia as an entity with its first climate disclosures, and our company is based in the group holding company is based in Canada. We also have subsidiary entities of WSP Australia in other countries. Their operations are covered as well by the disclosures that we are doing because they are part of the investment entity at issue. So it really comes down, in our experience, again, we are not lawyers, or at least I'm just a reformed lawyer. It really comes down to what entity you're looking at. And if it's an Australian entity, whether it's a subsidiary or has its own subsidiaries elsewhere, that meets those criteria, then you would be in.
Yeah, that's and also just in terms of a reflection on that, the AASB and the work that was done in terms of understanding the impact of this legislation did try and keep in mind consistency with international processes and taxonomies and standards that we're applying. There is obviously nuance as well when you're dealing with emissions factors from a different region as well, but it has been set up to be reasonably complementary, but there is always nuance in those processes. Was there a direct question that was coming through? If not, I might continue just with a couple of my own questions. We just briefly talked about the subsidiary situation. Are there any other sort of key misconceptions that people are coming through or that you're hearing when we're planning out our mandatory disclosure processes or transition plans? Things that you've seen sort of when you start the processes that people have a thought on and are quite surprised?
I can give one that physical impacts of climate change are actually pretty similar in the short term across scenarios. When we look at different climate change scenarios, the tendency is for clients to start talking about physical risks more in one of these hothouse scenarios, which in the case of the Australian requirements, there needs to be a greater than 2.5 degree warming scenario. So you're looking at like an RCP 7.0 or 8.5 kind of scenario. But the physical impacts of climate change are locked in. They are similar scenario to scenario in that short term. They get particularly catastrophic in the long term in a hothouse world scenario, but just because if you're focusing on a 1.5 degree aligned scenario, which is also required in Australia, that doesn't mean that you're not thinking about increasing physical impacts. Those are baked in, and they will only get worse even in a 1.5 degree scenario. And just on a 1.5 degree scenario, and David, I'd be keen for your view on this too. There's been a lot of talk about whether or not it's worth even doing a 1.5 degree scenario, given that we are effectively, at least at this stage, in a post 1.5 degree world. I liken it to doing a health check. You would not just be waiting on environmental factors that affect your health to change, rather than doing everything that was in your control, especially in a scenario analysis exercise where you're just testing your resilience, to try to figure out what actually you can do, what it would be like for you in a 1.5 degree world. I think it's more important than ever to actually be able to to take that test and to see how resilient your organization actually is. And we're talking about plausible scenarios, so it's still very much within the realm of plausibility that there could be an overshoot and then an undershoot. That would be a very unpleasant scenario, I think, for everybody, but they're all unpleasant scenarios in their own way. They're all disruptive scenarios in their own way. But yeah, David, keen for your views on 1.5 degree scenarios.
Yeah, I mean, I think, the world is not planning to give up on 1.5, but I think the reality is that we are at 1.5 near enough now. And last week, the UK Committee on Climate Change recommended that the UK should be preparing at least for a 2-degree climate change. That's their view of most likely scenario. So yeah, I think by all means do the 1.5 degrees, but don't just say, okay, well, this is the best bet. That's going to be the reality. The reality is that there is report after report that shows that generally today companies are totally underprepared for climate change. The report I was reading, and I've alluded to a little bit in some of my presentation, that the food and drink sector, especially, very reliant on nature, very reliant on quite long supply chains. That there are some very, very significant risks in nature-based value chains, which food and drink is, and generally the industry is poorly prepared for those.
There's been some more questions come in that I might also just come to. So there was one that Laura has raised around a company in asset management report on the financial impacts of their organisation, when that were predominantly being a portfolio of holdings that they're responsible for operating. So it's not a direct impact on the business, it's rather indirect impact through their clients. So it's an interesting one. I'm not sure if anybody wants to take a thought of that. And I mean, I might just have a quick start on that. I guess the key thing is it is certainly an impact to your business if it is impacting your clients. So that is part of the transition planning, and also understanding the impacts of climate change. And as David was saying as well, the really important thing is understanding the indirect or the interconnected impacts. So it absolutely would be part of your reporting requirements. But I'm not sure if anybody wanted to add anything more about that.
Yeah, absolutely. Just kind of second what you said, Bernadette. And I guess maybe just add to that in that, yeah, you could absolutely go through kind of a systematic process to actually look at those impacts to your downstream for your clients, and then understand what's material about those impacts that would then have an indirect effect on you as a business as well. So yeah, absolutely.
Okay, great. And there's another question also around, this one's quite interesting because it was very similar for us at WSP, where you're dealing with businesses, accounting firms, tech firms, where it's more of a knowledge type based deliverable or asset that we're reporting on. How does that work through what is considered a material risk? And again, reflecting on that process from WSP's perspective, it was quite an interesting process. It was very client focused for us, really trying to understand where the impacts were on our clients and how that might impact revenue streams, ability to get to client locations, project locations, things like that. But again, reflections from anyone else?
Yeah, I mean, I'll pick that up. I mean, so yeah, Miriam, it's a good question. WSP, we've disclosed our climate risks globally for the last 2 years. Actually, we're just in the process now of preparing an updated global aligned both climate disclosure and also nature disclosure assessment as well. I think, as Bernadette says, there's in some respects for us as WSP, there's I hesitate to say an upside to climate change, but climate change will impact the advice we give to our clients. As a third of our business, 23,000 of us work in environmental and sustainability related areas. So you could see there's a scenario where we have more work in that to help our clients get ready for weather extremes and the like. Other areas will sunset where there's less work in those areas. So that's, as Bernadette says, the main area. We've also looked very, very carefully at our corporate risks as well. We asked our staff last year, and we did a survey asking how many had been impacted by climate change in their ability to get into the office, in terms of their ability to work. And the results were very interesting, and they're in our disclosure reports as well.
Great, and we're going to run out of time, but there's one from Mohammed that's come through, and I did have a specific view on this around sizing of electrical equipment and electrical systems for the varying impacts of climate change. I won't give you a number, but suffice to say, yes, it should be a consideration, and no, it isn't necessarily already factored into the standards. That's been one of our biggest challenges, is the standards are not necessarily always clear. They may not necessarily have developed that content. So it is something that unfortunately we are having to deal with on a case-by-case and project-by-project basis often. But because, again, WSP Future Ready, and that is a key part of what David's framework that he leads internationally for us is to actually be checking, asking, and making sure that is part of the consideration of the work that we're doing in engineering. Just to conclude today, I did have one final question, and maybe it's one for you, Matt, or anybody else who has an idea, is, I guess, in your view, what is a good disclosure process? How long should people be thinking about for it? And are there any key technical SMEs? Maybe you can answer that in a couple of minutes, or might be a bit harder.
The best kinds of disclosure processes are ones that have the buy-in of the leadership of the organization. So hopefully this session has reassured some of you that this is a challenging process. It is a time-consuming process, and there's no way to kind of get around that time-consuming bit, but it's not an impossible process. It's not like an unduly challenging process. And you're not being asked to do anything that you can't do. It does help you, though, to identify the things that are within your control, the things that aren't, and the wisdom to know the difference, I suppose. But yeah, I don't know. I'd pass on to David, too, to see if he had any thoughts on what makes a good process in addition to that time investment and buy-in.
I think just as I've said all the way through, the best disclosures that we have done are embedded in understanding climate risk. They're not starting with we've got to produce a report in X period of time. Fundamentally, absolutely, you have to comply with the law on disclosure, but just don't see it as a disclosure piece led by a disclosures team. Embed it in your business, like Matt said, and then if you do that, then whether it takes 12 months, 9 months, 6 months, most organizations have the time. Get on with it now, build on what you've done, and really treat that as an effective program to get ahead of competitors.
Right, I think we'll call that a day, but thank you everybody for joining. I hope it's useful. We wanted to create something that was useful, but if there are any more questions, there are people on the screen very welcome to take further feedback, and if you have anything more that you want to find out or get our view on, happy to take those emails from you all. Thank you.